Associate Professor of History and Director of Public History here at UCF, and I'm here to welcome you on behalf of the university, on behalf of the College of Arts and Humanities, and on behalf of the Department of History. And it's been a great day already today. We had a panel discussion at noon, and tonight we have a wonderful roundtable scheduled. My task is very easy. I'm just simply introducing the introducer. The organizer, she's much more than an introducer. She's the organizer of this event, the visionary behind it. Dr. Connie Lester, she's the editor of the Florida Historical Quarterly and director of our Bridges digital repository. And she's going to tell you all about tonight's event. Dr. Lester.
Good evening, and welcome to the 7th Annual Jerrell Shofner Lecture of Florida History. I'm going to say a few words first about the lecture and its origins. The lecture series is an outreach of the Florida Historical Quarterly, which is the peer-reviewed scholarly publication of the Florida Historical Society. The offices of the Quarterly are here in the History Department at UCF, and the Society's headquarters are in Cocoa. The Florida Historical Quarterly is in its 98th year of publication and came to UCF from the University of Florida in the mid-1990s. Dr. Shofner at the time was chair of the History Department, and he was instrumental in bringing the Quarterly to UCF. And as a result of that, for a brief period of time, he was its first editor at UCF. And the lecture series was named to honor his contributions to Florida history, his work as editor, his scholarship, and his service as a past president of the Florida Historical Society. Dr. Shofner was able to attend the inaugural lecture in 2013, but unfortunately his health did not permit him to be present for any of the other lectures. On April the 11th, 2017, he passed away. The lecture has continued to grow, and for the first time this year, we offered 2 opportunities to engage with Florida history and meet the foremost historians of the state's history. There are several people we need to thank before we get to the evening's events. Organizing an event such as this is never the work of one individual. It takes a village, literally, to do this. So I want to thank the Department of History, the College of Arts and Humanities, the College of Arts and Humanities Alumni Relations, and the UCF Interdisciplinary Studies, who partnered with the Florida Historical Quarterly to make the lecture possible. There are a number of individuals who deserve special thanks for the work that they did on this as well. In the Dean's Office, Heather Gibson, Kara Robertson, and Azella Santana helped us with getting things organized. In the Center for Humanities and Digital Research, Dr. Michael Shire was instrumental in helping us. In the History Department, there's a long list, so bear with me. Syra Ambrosecchio, Alicia Campbell, Tiffany Rivera, Kayla Campana, Jeffrey Provero, and coming in at the last minute, I should say, Kirk Lundgren was very helpful this morning. Special thanks, though, go to Rachel McGovern, who is our FHQ intern for this semester. She just got everybody organized and kept the ball rolling this whole time. Among other things, she was in charge of corresponding with the 6 scholars presenting in the afternoon and the evening events. And I want to say thank you so much, Rachel, because you were a lifesaver. We have a couple of people who I want to recognize tonight who are in the audience. There are a number of faculty members from the History Department, and I want to say thank you for coming. We have faculty members from several other departments as well, but we have, as a special guest, Mr. Mike Perkins, who is the director of the Orange County Regional History Center. We're happy to have him here. I'm going to now introduce our discussants, and then I'm just going to step back and let them do their thing. So this is a conversation. Unlike the panel today where people made special presentations, this is going to be a discussion between scholars about Florida environmental history, and we will invite you to participate in that discussion as well. So, our first discussant is Dr. Jack Davis, who's a professor of history and Rothman Family Chair in the Humanities, specializing in environmental history and sustainability studies at the University of Florida. He is also the Pulitzer Prize-winning author of The Gulf, The Making of an American Sea in 2017. Upon joining the faculty at UF, he founded the department's student journal, Alpata, and a journal of history. His own book, Race Against Time, Culture, and Separation in Natchez Since 1930, won the Charles S. Sydnor Prize for the best book in Southern history, published in 2001. And for those who don't know, that is a really big prize. His book, An Everglades Providence, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas and the American Environmental Century in 2009, received a gold medal from the Florida Book Awards. Davis is currently editing a new edition of Wild Heart of Florida, a collection of personal essays and poems about natural Florida. In April 2019, Dr. Davis was one of the recipients of the 2019 Andrew Carnegie Fellowship Award. Our second discussant is Michelle Navakas. She is an associate professor of English and affiliate of American Studies at Miami University of Ohio, where she teaches early American literature, culture, and environment. She also co-chairs the American Culture Seminar, an interdisciplinary research cluster supported by Miami's Humanities Center. She is the author of Liquid Landscapes, Geography and Settlement at the Edge of Early America from the University of Pennsylvania Press in 2018. And her essays have been published in American Literature, Early American Literature, and Early American Studies. Currently, she is working on her second book, Coral in Early American Literature, Science and Culture. And I should add, though she didn't give us this information for me to say, that she was a winner of one of the prizes, two of the prizes, from the Florida Historical Society for her book, Liquid Landscapes. Our moderator commenter, I have known for quite some time now, Mark Hersey is an associate professor at Mississippi State University and co-editor of Environmental History, the Journal of the American Society for Environmental History and the Forest History Society. His research interests lie in the fields of environmental, rural, and agricultural history, with a particular emphasis on the American South, most especially on Alabama and Mississippi. His first book, My Work is That of Conservation, an environmental biography of George Washington Carver, which was published by the University of Georgia Press in 2011, situated the agricultural and environmental work of George Washington Carver in the context of both the conservation movement and of the early 20th century and the environmental history of Alabama's Black Belt. So please welcome our participants and have an enjoyable evening.
Alrighty, well thanks for coming out tonight. We thought we would begin by not rehashing the introductions that you just heard, but by allowing our panelists to introduce themselves a little. So I'm going to begin with just a series, well, the first of a long series of questions here. So both of you are natives of Florida. You've written about the state's environmental history, and I think it might be useful for the audience if you could tell us a little bit about what brought you to your subjects, and to what degree this was shaped by your experience as Floridians, and to what degree it was driven by other considerations. Michelle, please.
Yeah, sure.
Turn.
Is this okay? No? Yes? All right. Thank you so much. I'm just so happy to be here and be participating in this panel. I thought a lot about this question, and I thought a lot about it over the years as the book has come out, and I've wondered why it is that I've written a book on Florida. But I think I would say Florida's best gift to me as a scholar is that it made me really sensitive to things that are getting left out of our national narrative and things that are being deemed almost like too weird to be included in the national narrative. And what I mean by that is, so I grew up here and I went to graduate school and I studied early American literature and culture. And I sort of thought after about a year or two, like something's missing here. I'm not really hearing a whole lot about Florida and about the Florida environment that I know so well and that I know was such an important part of early America in these courses. So I decided to start looking and finding out, well, what were people writing about specifically the Florida environment between the Revolutionary War and Reconstruction? How are they thinking about it? And you know, it turns out that these landscape features that we think of as so local, like Florida reefs and swamps and savannas, were actually topics of really national concern for a variety of reasons. I have a lot of examples that I want to talk more about, but they, you know, for example, I can give one now, Florida Everglades. Those are a huge challenge to U.S. slavery. So people were talking about the Everglades a lot, as you know very well, in the 19th century because the landscape was harboring these marine communities. So it was a huge challenge to a major national narrative. And there's a lot of other reasons why these local features were important. So I wanted to end up writing a book about the ways that Florida challenged these national narratives. Ideas about property, for example, were challenged here, about community, about settlement, because the land is always shifting. But I also ended up writing a book about how Florida not only challenges these things, in other words, familiar concepts of land don't just break down here, but Florida generates new and really, I think, more sustainable ways of taking root because people had to learn how to adapt to this place. And so I ended up writing a book that shows, I hope at least, that there are really important lessons we can learn to attending to the ways that people talked about a landscape that's neither land nor water. And I think we need those lessons now.
So I'm not actually a native of Florida. My family moved to Florida when I was 10 years old, and so before then I lived in Birmingham and Atlanta. And so my natural environment in baby boom neighborhoods, my natural environment there was the woods. But then when we moved to Florida on the water in Fort Walton Beach on the Panhandle, and then later down to the Tampa Bay area, suddenly I left the woods and I entered the estuary. And it was fascinating to me. Of course, I didn't realize that I was looking at an estuary, or I didn't know that I was playing in an estuary. I was just looking at it. And I didn't understand what an ecosystem was, much less a marine ecosystem. And I venture to say my elementary school teachers didn't either. But I was fascinated by it nevertheless. And as I've said elsewhere and written elsewhere, when I was a kid growing up in the water, we no longer were living in a baby boom neighborhood full of kids my age and bicycles and everything else. The estuary became the cul-de-sac of my youth, and the beaches and the docks became my sidewalks, and the little red 12-foot square back canoe with a 6-horse Johnson motor became my bicycle, and a rod and reel became my bat and ball. And I like to say that, because it's true, that my book on the Gulf of Mexico began in my childhood on those estuarine environments. But also, growing up in Florida, as Michelle can attest, nothing's long-lived. Things change overnight. You can leave Florida for a short period and come back, and you're lost driving down the road because your landmarks that once were there are suddenly gone. And so I grew up witnessing a lot of change in places where there had once been 2-lane highways that were suddenly expanded into 4-lane and then to 6-lane and so forth. And I saw a lot of green spaces and a lot of watery spaces lost. And so that, of course, piqued my interest. I read River of Grass, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas's classic, while lying on my back in a tent in the Everglades. And so there was no escaping becoming an environmental historian.
So both of you addressed this, I think, sort of implicitly, but I wonder if you could do so more explicitly, address the ways in which you hope your scholarship changes the way in which people think about which landscapes prove most important to the larger American story.
Well, since I've got the microphone, I'll start. Well, let me talk for a moment about the Gulf book, use that as an example, and then give an example of my next book on the bald eagle. When I was searching, after I finished the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas biography and was searching around for a new book to write, I was naturally, because I grew up on the Gulf of Mexico and this lifelong intimate relationship with it, I was naturally drawn to that. I wanted to write another biography of a place, and then I realized, as I was looking into the possibility about writing on the Gulf of Mexico, I realized nobody had written a comprehensive history of the Gulf of Mexico. And Michelle mentioned the national narrative. It's completely missing from the national narrative. You can go to any high school or college American history textbook, and more than likely you will not find the Gulf of Mexico in the index. And if you do, it's only mentioned in passing. So I saw a need there to write this history and to bring it into the national narrative. And so I hope that in writing, and I wrote this book not as an academic book. My colleagues were never on my mind as I was writing this book, to be honest with you. I wrote it for a national audience, and not just a regional audience, because I wanted Americans, I wanted all Americans to know that they are connected to the Gulf of Mexico, both historically and ecologically, whether you've seen the Gulf of Mexico or not. And I think this is in another question, but I'll talk more about the idea of regionalism and boundaries later. But and with the Bald Eagle book, it's a discussion I want to start, or I want to shift the environmental writing narrative just a bit to talk more about success rather than destruction, rather than dismal history, dismal consequences of human behavior. And the Bald Eagle is this wonderful success story that appeals to everybody. It's the perfect opportunity to engage environmental writing and to write for more than the converted or the choir. To appeal to a politically broad audience. Because who doesn't love the bald eagle? Whether you love it as a symbol or love it as a species, everybody loves the bald eagle.
So I have an answer, but it's also sort of a question for you based on your answer. So what I wanted to say in response to this is that I was sort of surprised in writing my book about how through encounters with Florida, I noticed a real environmental, what I think we would call now an environmental awareness in earlier writing about the landscape. So just to give one small example, when property surveyors came down to Florida in the 18th century, they brought with them this notion that the land is fixed in one place. But that quickly became apparent, that was not in fact true. So instead of producing property surveys where the land is like marked and sharply bounded in squares, one of the figures I look at, named William George Abram, came down and made these almost like geological surveys that tell the property owner, well, this is what your land looked like in the past probably based on the water, and it's probably going to keep eroding in the future. And so he tried to actually draw this into the survey. So there's all this weird shading. And so it was really interesting to me because it showed that there was a deep environmental awareness of like the landscape is going to change. While I was reading your book, what I was thinking about is whether or not you'd agree that people did have that deep, almost like environmental awareness, because there are so many parts of your book, like when you're talking about fishing in the Gulf, it's really like disheartening to see how people treated the Gulf. I'm trying to remember your phrase, but you say something like a bottomless well. And I wonder, I don't know, from your own experience, is it crazy to think that like there was more of a sense of I don't care that we've actually lost now? Would you put it that way, or?
We've actually lost.
Like a sense of care and understanding of like the landscape, where like it's very
You mean
very
present day?
easy.
Yeah.
Because I went to your book thinking from my book, oh, there are these really important lessons we can learn, and then I was like, wow, some people that you talk about in your book we do not want to emulate that behavior now. So I don't know if you have things to say on that or not.
I think that, if we're talking, say, the 19th century, whether or not people had an awareness of the changing land or the changing waterfront, I think those who were part of the working waterfront community clearly did, who were out there every day, very much. Fisher people very much like farmers. They know what's going on, and they know that things do change. But then there are those that also believe that, and this is an old story that we're all familiar with, that we can dominate nature, that we can control nature, and that we can fix it.
Yes.
And not realizing that and fixing it, they're really screwing it up. And ultimately, some do and ignore that. The Army Corps of Engineers is a very good example of that. Before they even finished straightening out the Kissimmee River, they realized they had screwed up and that they needed to restore the Kissimmee River. But instead, the Army Corps of Engineers finished the straightening job and then told Congress, okay, we'll be your restoration folks down here in the Everglades and we'll fix it. And so there is obviously a difference. That's involved. There are the, as in the 19th century and earlier, there are the absentee landowners who don't pay attention except for the bottom line, and those still exist today. I think it's really wacky, if you will, what's going on today with the real estate prices in a place like New Orleans have never been so high. Why? I can't figure out why. And of course, South Beach in Miami, real estate prices are outrageous. How do they even get homeowners insurance? They don't. Why is it that there's a real estate boom in these extremely vulnerable places? And again, I think it's people who are in it for the short term that realize, okay, down the road there will be issues, but with luck I won't be around, or I won't take the hit in some way, unfortunately. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to also say, I think too, one of the problems is people have a really hard time deciding where to live and what's safe because they can't even see the landscape anymore. And so I guess probably through your work too, I think one of the sort of values of your book is you're also showing us a landscape for what it in fact actually is. Like revealing, almost making visible a landscape that might be missing to people, or they might not even realize it's there because of all of the modern engineering has drained and ditched. And so I was hoping to do a similar type of thing. I love that your book is organized around landscape features of the Gulf to try to make that visible, and that's actually my book as well. It's organized around the landscape features of Florida, and I think it's for that reason, is to try to make visible what I think people don't realize they're actually, the land that they're actually living on, so it can't be seen anymore. So I thought that was something.
Yeah, as I say in the Gulf book, on the modern day Barrier Island, particularly in southwest Florida, in the Tampa Bay area where I grew up, you can be on that island and not even know you're on an island because you don't see the water because the condos are in the way, or because of the causeways and the bridges deceive you into thinking that you're still on the mainland. It's really extraordinary that we don't notice what we're really living on, and we don't notice with many of our senses, all of our senses. It's not just sight, but it's sound, it's smell, and of course the sound that's often drowned out by the civilization, the sounds of civilization or the built environment. And I think that I think it's important that, and I encourage young people and also the students in my writing seminar that when you write, you really have to, and you're writing about a place, even if it's not the central subject of your work, but if a place enters it, you need to go learn about that place. You need to experience it. Even if it's a 19th century place, you need to go experience it today and absorb it through all your sense. You need to have, develop a sensorial experience with the place. One of the saddest things I learned recently was that in 2015, the Oxford Children's Dictionary dropped 50 words related to nature, including starling, acorn, and that beloved bird to all of us here, the heron. 50 words related to nature. So at a time when the young generation should be learning about nature, and without language, what do you lack? You're missing something profound in your culture, and you're missing the opportunity to develop a relationship with that wider world.
I'm going to tweak a question that I posed to you guys sort of in advance. And because what the question initially wrote for the audience is that in the wake of major hurricanes like Dorian, the media often responds by asking why people continue to inhabit vulnerable or at-risk coastal landscapes in the first place. And then I was asking how their research might help us think more profitably about that question. But if I build on the comments you guys have been, the discussion you just had, maybe I could expand that to how historical research helps us understand a place, which seems to be at the heart of what you guys were talking about, the sense of place.
Maybe my answer will be for both. I mean, I think your question maybe comes from, your original question came from the spirit of the sort of way the national media will cover a hurricane and say, what are people doing living there anyway? They shouldn't be living there. What are they thinking, right? Like, that's just a pretty common sort of national narrative I think we hear in the wake of hurricanes. And I think that, yeah, one thing, I feel like, why are we asking that question? Shouldn't we be asking, how do people live here for thousands of years in the first place? Because there's a whole history of people living on this landscape for thousands of years. For example, look at the Pulitzer Indians in Southwest Florida. So they figured out how to live by building these fascinating floating houses that I know you describe a little bit in your book also, because you talk about the ethnographer Frank Hamilton Cushing, who goes down in the late 19th century and finds on these mounds the remnants of basically like aquatic architecture. So there are these floating mounds with these stilted houses on them. They're not like regular stilted houses because the houses actually rise when the waters rise as well, so that they are able to kind of go up and down with the water table. So there was a real recognition in Pulitzer architecture that enabled them to survive for thousands of years in places where there were hurricanes and heavy tides. And so I'm not saying we should all build, like, go live on mounds and stuff. I mean, that would be great, we could do that. But I guess what I'm saying is that sense of adaptation is what I feel like that is what's missing from the story of Florida. It's not that this was a place that is just entirely uninhabitable. I'm not telling everyone to leave, but I'm sort of saying if you're gonna live here for the long term, there are so many historical lessons you can take from people, especially indigenous people, who figured out how to make it work.
So I'm a part of this Mellon Foundation supporting consortium that includes University of Florida, University of Georgia, Chapel Hill, and LSU, looking at this very question about the waterfront and transitions and adaptations. And this is, I mean, we're just launching this project now, and so we hope to learn something from the history about adaptation. And of course, adaptation sometimes means surrendering and leaving. And I was a little glib earlier when I responded to the question about why do we live in these vulnerable places. And one thing that of course we all know is the role of the federal government. Federal policy helps us stay in harm's way, particularly through FEMA. The people of Mexico Beach who want to move away cannot get FEMA funding to rebuild elsewhere, which is counterintuitive, particularly in this day and age. And then, of course, there's also the draw of tradition and family. such as the Cajun culture in southern Louisiana, be very hard. It's hard. I mean, that of course, the Louisiana coast is losing the equivalent of Manhattan every year. Their roads are disappearing underwater before their very eyes, but it's very hard for them to leave because they have been there for generations and generations. And this is what they know. This is what's familiar and predictable to them, even when it's unpredictable. That's part of the predictable part, is being unpredictable. And so it's, this is like in ecological science, restoration science is still a new field. And I think it's for the humanities trying to understand why why communities stay in the same place, particularly vulnerable places, is certainly something we'll be exploring for some time.
I mean, I think what you're saying sort of raises for me the question, or maybe it comes back to the question you're asking about what the humanities can contribute at a time of climate crisis. And I like to think that it can, contribute this, help people maybe shift their deeply held conceptions that they've had forever. I mean, take marshlands, for example, right? We all, not we all in this room, but in popular culture, there's this notion that marshlands are terrible places, right? This is sort of historically, like they need to be filled in and they're too wet. All these kinds of negative connotations surrounding marshlands is pretty popular thing, like draining the swamp, right? That kind of stuff. I think that one of the things we can do through literature, for example, is say, actually, marshlands are, they absorb tidal surge. You need marshlands. Let's value marshlands. And historically, people didn't just ditch and drain them. They actually converted them into really useful resources and places to live. They sustained communities. They sustained maroon communities, for example, of Seminole Indians and their African allies escaping from slavery. These places sustained populations. So I guess I'm just saying, I think that's one way teaching literature can sort of help shift narratives about popular ideas that I think are deeply environmentally harmful. But to then take it to another extreme, I wonder if stories and literature and narratives can't help people shift out of even the notion of home as being a fixed place that you live in and stay and that you pass on to multiple generations. Like, that might be a wildly radical suggestion because our ideas of home are so not that. It's so deeply American to have a piece of property and to fence it in and to keep it forever and to envision passing it on. And I wonder if there's not anything that it's such a complicated concept. You can't tell people to leave. Like you're saying, these communities and these places, they are tied to the place. But I wonder if part of if narrative can't at least get people to think about some alternative to that. Maybe even reconceiving these massive concepts, and not just like on marshland and what it means, but also what does home mean? What does it mean to take root in a single place?
One of the discussions we've had in this consortium is in regard to these local communities and people is to ensure that they help write that narrative. That they're very much among the authors of it. Exactly. As a historian and a humanities scholar, I have always been living in Mississippi for 2.5 years and writing a book about Mississippi before I wrote the Natchez book taught me the importance of place or a sense of place, but also it introduced me to history of blues music and literature, Southern literature, in a way I'd not been introduced to it before. And so it excited me or encouraged me to incorporate, as a historian, literature and art, music, the humanities, film, into my historical research, because I very much believe that when we go back to the 19th or 18th century and we read what people are writing, we read what the literary folks are writing, we look at the paintings, you see them, if not shifting the narrative or trying to shift the narrative, they're expanding it at the very least, or they're adding something to it that the average individual might not have been aware of. I think that artistic people, creative people, are very much in tune with the world in ways that others aren't. And we can learn a lot from them, both today, but also from those in the past. To give you an example, I've written 3 chapters for the Bald Eagle book, and I counted it recently. In those 3 chapters, I draw on the work of something like 8 artists, 4 or 5 fiction writers, and some others, because it's just remarkable what I'm learning from them. But the other thing that's great about them is they enliven your narrative, and they draw in an audience that you might not otherwise, appeal to.
I love the inclusion of Winslow Homer in your book, the painter from the 19th century, because I do talk about some of his paintings as well, and I think that is absolutely what you're saying. It really resonates with people to see that this wasn't just some dry academic subject, but you have these stories and imaginings and sometimes the imagination of how to think about place differently. I think it can be really useful for people. The one that I love teaching, which I don't know if you teach in your courses, is William Bartram's travel narrative from 1791. And it's sort of like, well, why would I read a travel narrative from 1791? This guy goes down to Florida from Philadelphia, he's collecting some plants. What's the point? It's 2019. But when you read that, you see, first of all, it's a beautiful book. I think it draws people in with this incredibly poetic language of Florida's swamps and springs and changing coastlines. It's just astonishingly written. But I think for me, also, he describes roots, literal roots of plants in multiple places that take root by spreading over the surface of the earth, these sort of lateral roots. The plants are able to stay in Florida because they can kind of move with the landscape. They don't need to be deeply fixed in one place, but they figure out how to take roots and to live and to thrive without, somehow in the absence of solid ground. And I just think that there's some really fascinating concepts of roots and what it means to stay in a place and to call a place yours that you might find in these narratives that I feel are deeply relevant to our current moment. So, I love that you're bringing more literary stuff. Of course, I would say that. I'm a scholar of literature, so thank you.
Yeah, of course. Bartram figures prominently in chapter 3 of the Eagle book. And I love writing about him. He's a fascinating guy. He was not a fan of the bald eagle.
Oh, really?
Because the bald eagle has a tendency to steal from other birds, particularly the osprey. So he, like Ben Franklin, saw the bald eagle as being a little dishonest, and of course Franklin compared the moral character of the bald eagle with the turkey. He never advocated the turkey for the national bird, but he did compare the morality of the two. So it's fun writing about people like this, and you get your reader's attention. Let me just real briefly talk about Winslow Homer. Yes. As Michelle suggested, I opened up the Gulf book with Winslow Homer. As we know, all of us who write books, the opening is the most important thing you write. And the very first words in the Gulf book were the very last ones I wrote, and I wasn't sure how to open this book. And Winslow Homer turned out to me and others, I think, to be the perfect person, because he's not from the Gulf. He's from Maine. He didn't see the Gulf of Mexico outside of Key West until he was in his late 60s. And what Winslow Homer does is he ties the Gulf to another part of the country. Because one of my arguments in the book is that this is, as I suggested earlier, it's not a regional sea, it's an American sea. So I could have started with Walter Anderson, the great Mississippi artist, laureate of the Gulf of Mexico. But I wanted to start with somebody like Winslow Homer, who was better known, but also from a faraway place.
So environmental history was born at a particular moment in the environmental movement, and it was born of a conviction that abstracting people, humans, from the other than human world, from the natural world, fundamentally distorts the historical narrative, right, that people are bound up in, right? Basically that that other disciplines had dealt with Darwin and taken him seriously, but historians, for all the things they had done, hadn't taken this notion that people were connected to the natural world very seriously. So Michelle talked about this a little bit, but maybe you could both talk a little bit more about how historical reflections really can help us deal with ecological problems today, or the degree to which they can. And then I have a follow-up question after that. You were to continue your thought.
Yeah, I guess I'll go back to just the ways that these narratives can help us rethink the land, and thereby, I guess that's, to me, that's the first step to figuring out how to live on it. So I don't think literature can suddenly, solve all of our problems immediately. What I think literature does so well is it helps us think through problems that remain pressing with us over time, right? So I think looking at the ways that other people face those challenges and reading those narratives and thinking through them helps us arrive at better solutions to the challenges that we're facing. So that's what I see as the particular power of literature and of narrative. I think narratives are incredibly persuasive. Facts are important. We need to know facts by NASA and UNESCO that climate change is happening. It's already here. We already know this. But I think what narratives can do is help us think through those problems, help us persuade people that those things are happening. When you read a story, sometimes you find yourself assenting to things and agreeing with them that you might not have realized you were. I think narratives are really powerful in that, but also in helping us think through both the problem and then potential solutions to that problem. So I feel like I've given a lot of the examples that I wanted to make sure I gave, but I don't know. I mean, I think probably I do want to mention that the best book, I think all you really need to know, maybe you'll agree with me, is in Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God. I think that if you just read that, you're good. I don't think, to me, that, and I guess what I mean to sort of relate it back to your question, it's not as historical as the novels that or as the work I usually write about. I'm an early Americanist, so most of the things that I write about were published before 1900, and Zora Neale Hurston is writing in the 1830s, or 1930s, I'm sorry. And what that book does so incredibly beautifully and well is, I think it shows that the landscape that we're inhabiting, and that she was inhabiting, is a landscape that is just filled with tremendous unknowns and tremendous risk. And that novel really brings that to the fore. For people who haven't read it, it tells a story. One central to that story is the hurricane of 1928, which swept through the central part of the state and killed, the estimates are between 2,500 and 3,000 people, most of them communities of color working in the Everglades. And the story essentially shows us that, it helps us rethink things like natural disaster, right? A term that it sounds like all the disasters are natural. What about hurricane was so bad because there had been such incredibly poor planning around how to put a dike around the Lake Okeechobee, basically. So because of all of this engineering of the landscape, that's what made the hurricane so much worse than it would have been otherwise. And so I think once you see that and you see the sort of the way that played out, and you can understand what that must have been like, I think that, to me, that's a really just powerful example of how a story that is fictional can help us rethink of a huge, like a much larger concept like natural disaster. How natural is it? Wasn't it kind of man-made? I think so. And I think those things come through in literature in a way that maybe other types of data or information might not convey.
So, as an environmental historian, as Mark well knows, we're very interested in connections. Conventional historians tend to love conflict. We like conflict too, but we're really fascinated by connection. And it goes hand in hand with ecology, right? Ecology is part of something we do. We study ecosystems, and those connections can be between people, they can be between places, they can be between species, they can be between events. But almost in every case is an environmental historian interested in the connection between the past and the present and the future. Whereas many conventional historians don't necessarily bring their connections up to the present, but environmental historians do, because they understand that the challenges we are facing today have antecedents that date back 500 years, at least in North America, and more than 500 years. But we're also very interested in not just the human impact on nature, but how nature shapes the course of human history. Which is something that non-environmental historians rarely think about. The nature or the environment becomes an ornamental backdrop. Briefly in the introduction, and then it's just about forgotten. But here's where literature can also help. I think a wonderful book that I would place there with Zora Neale Hurston, Their Eyes Are Watching God, which is just a phenomenal book. It is an absolutely perfect example of a literary person. She was also an anthropologist who was very much attuned with the human condition, very observant of her surroundings, both the human and non-human. Another writer of Florida was, can anybody guess? Marjorie Kennedy Rollins. The Yearling hardly anybody reads it now. It won the Pulitzer Prize in, what was it, 39? Something like that, and 38, 39. Hardly anybody reads it now. But when you do, it's remarkable. This woman had only lived in Florida for 10 years, and the way she understands and paints the relationship between rural folk and their environment is truly extraordinary and in such great detail. Also, I think that at this point at this date in American history, in the 21st century, we've had our pleasure in trashing the past. Now I think it's time for us to, and I mentioned this earlier, to focus on what we did right in the past. And I made it a point in the Gulf of Mexico book to end on a high note, to end with a success story, which was the Cedar Key, which I won't go into detail. If you want to know what that story is, you'll have to find the book over there. So, I'll give you one quick success story. It gives me hope for the future. How many of you guys grew up in Florida? How many of you guys over 40 grew up in Florida? Okay, just one?
That's my mom.
What? Hey, Mom. All right, Mom,
Yes.
you can probably relate to this. But in the late 1960s, virtually every bay and bayou in Sound in Florida and around the Gulf Coast was on the verge of death. They had lost 50, 60, 70 in cases of Escambia Bay and Pensacola, 95% of their seagrass beds. The places were dying. When I was a kid fishing on Tampa Bay in the early 70s, about the only fish I could catch was a croaker. If I got really lucky, I could catch a speckled trout. And the only birds we saw, maybe you saw it in South Florida. Did you grow up in Southeast Florida? Where'd you grow up?
Titusville.
Oh, Titusville. Okay. The only birds, you may have seen more, but in Tampa Bay, the only birds we ever saw were brown pelicans and gulls back in the 60s and the 70s. But what happened, we got our act together. We cleaned those bays and bayous up, thanks in part to the Clean Water Act of 1972. But everybody pitched in, including the polluting industries, pitched in to clean up these waters and brought them back to thriving life. Some of these bays and bayous have enjoyed more than 100% seagrass regrowth. A great success story that we should celebrate, that we should, blow our horns about. And I see it as the predecessor of what we're doing today with the living shoreline, those mangrove forests, those again seagrass beds and oyster beds in coastal marshes that have disappeared or shrunken. We're bringing those back because they are our best defense against tidal surges, against intense weather generally, and much better than seawalls concrete seawalls also contribute to erosion. But here's the win-win-win. This is things we should be sounding out really loudly. Win-win-win with the living shoreline, the original shoreline, is that yes, they attain high seas, intense weather, their nursery and habitat, but they're also fantastic carbon sinks, absorbing carbon out of the water and out of the air. And so there is connection, an example of a connection I'm trying to make between the past and the present and the future.
So, let me ask the follow-up question that I promised, and I think you probably guessed your answer, but and it probably actually seems like a leading question actually in a venue like this. But it's a question with serious ramifications, because when you talk about the Clean Water Act, it was a very different political environment at the time, where being publicly outspoken for environmental things did not put you on a particular partisan side. And taking sides is a risky endeavor. So what role should scholars in the environmental humanities play in trying to shape current political debates, and in fact shape the nation's interaction with its natural endowments more broadly? To make this sort of like a reductionist question, right? Like, to what degree should our disciplines function as pure disciplines, where we're interested in knowledge, and to what degree should they function as sort of useful or applied disciplines?
This is out of the microphone in my hand. I'm going to start first, and I think we should start with language. And you said it right. I love your term, natural endowments. Now, what is the term that would normally be used in its place? Natural resources. Resource is a commodity. Endowment is nature, or it can be nature. And so I think we need to start with language. Management. There's a lot of talk in policy, a lot of talk in the sciences about the need for land management, wildlife management. But what does management mean? It means human manipulation. And management often comes with a lot of mistakes. And then there, of course, is game rather than wildlife, another word. And red tide, which just drives me crazy when people start talking about, particularly the media start talking about red tide when it's algae blooms, which is different. Red tide, as our previous governor did, lets humans off the hook and blames nature for what's happening on those shorelines. Because red tide is a natural phenomenon. But what's happening, or has happened on the southwest coast, is more than natural and very much a part of human behavior. But I think that humanities need to get outside of the university. They do themselves a disservice when humanists only speak to themselves and they speak in an arcane language that not even they can understand. I don't know, I know offense to your discipline, Michelle, but I've sat on a number of dissertation defenses in the English department, and I'm completely lost. I have no idea what's going on, and I have no idea what's going on in the dissertation. And everybody on the committee who's in the English department is praising this student for a wonderfully written, insightfully written work. And then when I start questioning the arcaneness of it, suddenly they jump on the bandwagon with me and say, you need to, maybe make it write a little bit more pithy sentences, not so convoluted and stuffed with $50 words and so forth. And I think we've got to learn a broader vocabulary as academics. We write in our own vocabulary, and it's really limited. We think it's not, because we use some really cool words that others don't understand. Well, that's part of it. I think we need to get the damn thesaurus out. I have the thesaurus.com open on my second screen all the time when I'm writing. And I think that I don't think you need to separate scholarship from readability. I think the two can go hand in hand. Yes, there are many of our colleagues who would have no business trying to write for a broader audience than their own colleagues. But somebody like you, Mark, and I've read a good bit of your writing. You're a wonderful writer. You certainly have the potential of reaching out there. And many of my colleagues who, in the history department at the University of Florida, have that potential too. Let those who want to stay isolated, but those that can break out. And then, because we have a lot of good ideas, and we have a lot of knowledge that we can share. And why let the journalist or the freelance writer take our scholarship and regurgitate it? And I think we should control our own scholarship.
Okay, that's kind of hard to follow. As a comment.
Sorry,
no, we can talk all day about the history dissertations that I've had, or the history panels at academic conferences, but I'm not going to talk about that. Oh no. I think, I don't know, thinking about this question, I wouldn't answer for, I don't think I could answer and say like, this is, as passionately as you have, which I so feel very much what you're saying about many parts of your answer. I'm not sure I could say this is what scholars should be doing now and this is how. I know for me, particularly when I'm teaching literature in the environment in the classes that I teach, the words that I feel resonate most with me are, Aldo Leopold said something like, we can be ethical only toward what we can see, right? I mean, he has this famous thing that he says, and I guess what I see myself doing is, at least in my classroom and then also through the deeply researched books that I write, and I do want to echo your point, why give it away to, I mean, journalists, this is nothing against journalists.
No.
Thank God for journalists. We need journalists. We're all on the same side here. This is not the time to attack journalists, for God's sake, or our fellow humanities people in other departments, but, just saying. But essentially, I guess my point is scholars have the resources. We're very privileged. We have the time and the resources and institutions that support us to do this incredible deep dives in research. So we have this knowledge to share, and we should share it. And I completely agree with you on that score. I guess to go back to that quote I just mentioned, I think when it comes to environmental issues, I do think that the problem is I think it's hard for them to make a connection to their daily lives when they hear the words climate change. It sounds so abstract, right? And you probably face this issue a lot, I'm imagining. People think of like polar bears and glaciers, and we all love polar bears and glaciers, but I think for me, it's getting people to see through writing, through narratives, through my teaching, how the things that seem so abstract are in fact part of their daily life, their daily actions have these links to these larger systems that we're trying to fight against. And I guess, the person that probably who does this best is someone like Rachel Carson in Silent Spring, right? I mean, she's talking about how people see these birds dying and they don't understand why and what could possibly be going on. And it's because the agent is invisible. You can't see DDT. And I think that's one of the largest challenges that I feel like at least I can help in my classroom and through my work with is getting people to sort of maybe re-see things that they might otherwise miss because they might not have the time, but I have the time and I can write that book and I can do the scholarship and the research, and I think that is an incredible gift and an incredible privilege that I have.
So, I just assume that stilted academic prose and history is self-evident.
Oh,
so,
okay. Well,
so I wasn't necessarily picking on your discipline, but I'm serious about the future survival of the humanities, of the disciplines within the humanities. When parents don't understand what the humanities are or is, they don't want their kids to major in one of the disciplines within the humanities. When the policymakers don't understand what it is, when those who vote on the state budget don't understand what the humanities is, they are not likely to support the humanities or see a value in the humanities. And so, which is one of the reasons why I think that we need to be more public-facing and to get our messages out there, to get our work out there, to show that we're doing something really cutting edge and important that's valuable to society. after all, we have to think about it. You know, up until the late 19th century, what did everybody study? You know, those quote-unquote great white men who made America, you know, who led the industrial age, who built all these big corporations that are now are big charities. Those guys were not trained in professional degrees. They all studied the classics. They all studied the humanities. It didn't hurt them.
All right. So, I had a question about how we periodize Florida's environmental history. Maybe we can do that quickly, and then we'll make sure the audience gets a chance to ask questions too. So, what are the, obviously, climate change, if some of the projections come out for the shifting coastline, that will mark a big moment. A big moment in Florida's environmental history. You guys write about the past. So what are those, what moments would you point to as the most important sort of pivotal moments in shifting the trajectory of Florida, the human natural nexus in Florida? You want to start?
It seems more like a question that I feel like you're going to have ready answers to. I'll think more.
So, here are the ones I give a talk for the Florida Humanities Council titled, what's the title? I can't remember its title. But it's pivotal moments in Florida's environmental history. And of course, one of those pivotal moments early on is the coming of the Europeans, the coming of the Spanish is clearly a pivotal moment in history. The other, of course, is the elimination of the Aboriginal peoples who lived a more stable relationship with the Florida environment than did the Europeans, and who, of course, brought cattle, our original cattle, and brought our original citrus, who brought commercial agriculture. Another pivotal moment that is William Marshall coming down here and discovering the biological wealth of this place, and and he wrote so beautifully about Florida, so eloquently, and about things that Euro-Americans were totally unfamiliar with. Many people accused him of fabricating his narrative. And I recently ran across a review, and I can't remember the newspaper, of travels, and it just, I've trashed a lot of books. I've never trashed a book so harshly as this one trashed travels. So another one, of course, is the ecotourism. Or it wasn't called ecotourism then, but Florida's original tourist trade, which was what? Started in interior Florida with the rivers and the springs. People came from all over, from the British Isles, from the Midwest and Northeast, to see Florida's nature, to see the big birds, to see the turtles, the otters, the alligators in particular, which brought what? It brought all these literary people to Florida too, who wrote about Florida and turned it into this national phenomenon within magazines and newspapers and books. And then I could go on and on and on, but World War II is a significant shift, pivotal moment in Florida history, because what happens? What does it introduce? It brings in the modern citrus industry. It brings in industrial agriculture. It, of course, brings in more people with air conditioning and mosquito control. And Disney, I cite Disney in my talk as one of those pivotal moments, which I don't have to explain to you guys.
I'll just add quickly that when you think about, how about the three Seminole Wars in the 19th century? I mean, it's really interesting when I talk to my students a lot about these wars between 1818 and 1858, which were essentially to eradicate the Seminole, removing them and slaughtering them. Most people don't really seem to know much about those wars or why they were fought. I mean, they were mostly fought to preserve U.S. slavery, so that escaping enslaved people from plantations did not have a safe harbor. That was the concern, is that Florida was a safe harbor for those populations, and so that's why the federal government went to war against the Seminole. And I had thought about that question, or that event, as those events that played out, the extraordinary violence across. I mean, do you think if that is one possibility is sort of a moment that was a pivotal turning point environmentally, I would imagine, as well? Because it was thought to settle Florida, to turn it into what it looks like now. So, yeah.
And I think a later day or latter day response to that is 1969. Does anybody know what key events happened in 1969 in Florida? Besides the state legislature finally officially recognizing the right of women to vote, but on the environmental front. Well, the creation of Friends of the Everglades by Marjorie Stoneman Douglas and the creation of Florida Defenders of the Environment by Marjorie Carr, and twin victories, stopping the construction of the Miami Jetport, as it was called, in the middle of the Everglades, and stopping the cross-Florida barge canal. Two major federal projects halted in the same state in the same year. Never happened before, and hasn't happened since. I think it does. 69 is a pivotal shift. Also, was it 68 or 69 that Bob Graham was elected to the Florida legislature? I think it was 69 that he came in. So a lot was going on. I'm sure we can dig deeper and find more.
All right. For folks who are beginning to get interested in Florida's environmental history, what 3 books, essays, works, we'll call them generically, would you mark as beginning points? Would you suggest this is where you should begin?
So for a survey, you want just books only?
It could be essays and years of that's key.
Well, I don't. All right, but let me stick with books. This way, I won't self-promote. I think Mark Durer's Some Kind of Paradise, which was published in 70, 79, 80, maybe it was 81. I think it's still relevant. It's dated in some ways, but it's also still quite relevant, and it's a highly readable book and a good survey of Florida's environmental history. Mark Durer, D-E-R-R, Some Kind of Paradise is one. I think Rivergrass, a lot of people know that book, but hardly anybody reads it. It's an extraordinary book, very insightful, extremely forward-looking. She understood exactly what was going on. She had, one of her big mistakes is she thought that the Army Corps of Engineers would save things. They ended up doing just the opposite. But Rivergrass is fantastic, and I've already mentioned the Yearling. And then I will plug one of my own books only because it's relevant, as Paradise Lost, with a question mark, that I co-edited with Ray Arsenault, which is a collection of essays on the environmental history of Florida. So those books will give you, I think I've got them all, will give you a decent overview, I think.
I wonder if you add to that Michael Grunwald's The Swamp.
Why would I add anything instead of mine?
Oh, well, that's a great question. Yeah, I don't know. I've taught chapters from that. I think it teaches very well. He writes very clearly and interestingly about the particular, my favorite chapter is, I wrote it down, Nature's Revenge. And it's basically about the Florida land boom and how the just unbelievable growth that happened along the coastline and in the interior in the 1920s, and how we're still to this day dealing with the residual effects of that. I think he's really good at unpacking that in just really compelling narrative. So I'd highly recommend that one, as well as Jack's book. And then I also, more recently, I don't know if this qualifies as environmental history, but one of the books that I read recently that I just think everyone needs to read right now is Elizabeth Rush's Rising, Dispatches from the New American Shore. It was published in 2018, so it just came out. It was nominated for the Pulitzer. It's this extraordinary study of people living in places that are being immediately compromised characterized by sea level rise in a variety of ways, and she lets the voices of those people living in those places really speak through the book. She's a journalist, but she spent something like a decade writing this book. It's extraordinarily well researched, and there is, in fact, a whole chapter on South Florida, and then there's also a chapter on Pensacola. So there's lots of Florida in there, and she talks about places like Shorecrest in north of Miami, where sunny day flooding, what's happening, well, that's sea level rise. And in Pensacola, talking to communities of color living along the coast and trying to figure out what are they going to do if they are living in a place that they own and it's slowly being encroached upon by the ocean. The stories are so vivid and so compelling, and really, ultimately though, the book is about language and about what language might do for us at a time of climate change. So it's about Florida, and definitely, but it's about the broader problems that the entire nation, arguably the world, especially living in coastal places, is facing now.
So I don't know about you guys, but I keep looking at this carpet and I see Mickey Mouse ears everywhere. It's driving me crazy. So let me mention two books on Florida water that I highly recommend. One is Cynthia Barnett's Mirage, a deeply researched, wonderfully written book, and also Blue Revolution, which goes beyond Florida. Blue Revolution is the other one, which goes beyond Florida, but Florida is a central character, if you will, in that book. And an oldie but goodie is actually Water into Land, Land into Water. By, what's the author's name? I've forgotten his name. It was a precedent-setting book. Nelson Blake. Yeah, Nelson Blake, Water into Land, Land into Water, and a pioneering work that everybody who writes about water in Florida consults.
All right, let me ask one question. We'll just open it up to the audience. So the last question is, what aspects of Florida's environmental history do we still need further exploration? Which ones remain understudied? If you had a rudderless graduate student, or maybe a motivated undergraduate student who was looking to go to grad school and research Florida's environmental history or environmental literature, where would you point?
And write unreadable prose. History of Florida agriculture hasn't been written. Pulp paper industry. A bleaching process was pioneered in Panama City, killed East Bay and Panama City. Again, language and ideas, I think. The Floridan aquifer needs a study. And the environmental history of Florida tourism. And a book on, a comprehensive book on Florida's rivers and springs. A book on the Florida Reef. The history of Florida, environmental history of Florida and the automobile, and the history of dredge and fill. And a lot of bits and pieces of dredge and fill have been written, but no comprehensive work.
I just want to build on one thing you said. Yeah, the Florida Reef, I completely agree. My second book is a cultural history of coral in early American culture, and I will have part of that will be partially a cultural history of the Florida Reef, which no one knows what that term is now not really a term we've used, but it's a 170-mile reef that is the nation's only, or the continental U.S.'s only living barrier reef, right? And living in quotes, okay, agreed. But in the 19th century, this was a really big deal. People were writing novels and stories about this and made it into the national news because one of the major concerns was a very problematic commercial concern of how to navigate this place. So when you think about where the Florida Reef is located, basically the commerce coming in and out of the mouth of the Mississippi to enter Atlantic trade routes had to pass over the Florida Reef. So how are you going to do that? People didn't understand coral terrain. How are they going to get a ship over that? And it wasn't just the reef, but it was also these wrecking communities. So communities of wreckers who would live along the reef and make their money by rescuing ships that had been wrecked, sometimes actually causing the wreck so that they could profit from the salvage of the wrecked ship. And fascinating stories, I think, that remain to be told about human-landscape interaction. But also, I would love a book that was just like about just the reef, because the reef needs our attention desperately. And so, yeah, I totally.
Bill Belleville was planning to write that book, but he's become ill, unfortunately. His book, River of Lakes, about the St. Johns River, is an extraordinary book that does a fabulous job of weaving history with the modern day and the environment. Highly recommend. Very poetic. I always said that Bill in that book was the modern day William Bartram, who he writes a lot about.
Okay, I think we can open it up to Jill.
I'm a new Floridian, so I really appreciate the book recommendations. I have a question that's not really a Florida question, but it came to mind when you were talking about living on a landscape and not being able to see it or hear it. And I feel like I'm seeing different kind of environmentalism, dominated by conversations about sustainability emerging, and less kind of like that natural history, biophilic kind of environmentalism or conservation is something like sustainability kind of environmentalism makes me think of Gifford Pinchot, for example. And I just was wondering if you could reflect on how the landscapes that people have lived on over time might shape the kind of environmentalism and conservation that has been around.
So I think a good example is Florida Springs. I don't know if you know much about them, but we have the highest concentration of first magnitude springs in the world north of here. We have some 700 springs and freshwater springs in the state. It's really extraordinary. And there is a deep memory of what these springs look like, both among individuals, but also in paintings and photographs. And of course, there's very much awareness of what they look like today and an understanding of what's happening. And this memory of the quote-unquote landscape has very much motivated a springs movement, an ecological environmental movement in north central Florida. And many people are involved. Just Google John Moran, M-O-R-A-N, who's one of Florida's great environmental nature photographers. And he is devoted, John's 64, and 2 or 3 years ago he stopped working, so I'm going to devote my life to raising awareness about these springs and trying to save them. So I think that's a good example. Same with mangroves, now that people better understand the ecological value of mangroves and the restoration in that regard, motivation to restore them, as well as the estuarine environment. There's very much a memory of what those environments were like.
Well, yeah, I was just going to say, were you with an earlier panel today from 12 to 1:30? There was an earlier panel, and where is the person who talked about the kind of creation of marine preserve or aquatic preserves? I find that person, or I can. Is he here? No, I don't know. He left. He went home. Okay, I'll find his name and connect you because I feel like it'd be really interesting. I'm sorry.
Chris Wilhelm.
Chris Wilhelm. Okay, talking about the kind of the ways that the aquatic preserve, the entire concept of that, largely being influenced by this desire to preserve an aquatic space in Florida. I was sort of fascinated by that story. So that's what I have to add to that. Is his insight.
So another one I just thought of was the Florida Wildlife Corridor, which include a lot of ranchers and growers because they have a lot of the lot of the people in agriculture are 3, 4, 5, 6 generation Floridians, and so they've seen a lot of the change, and they've seen a lot of the wildlife disappear, and so they have given significant support to restoring or creating a wildlife corridor that will run all the way up the peninsula. And then E.O. Wilson was involved in establishing, and the E.O. Wilson Biophilia Center in the Panhandle is very much involved in restoring the longleaf forest in the Panhandle, and restoring and creating a wildlife corridor that will span the Panhandle, and ultimately their goals go all the way across the continent.
Hi. So, as a writing student, I have kind of an interest in writing, environmental themes into fiction. However, I've noticed there's definitely a stigma today. Like, people kind of dismiss environmental fiction as being preachy, or people don't want to read it because they feel like it's being patronizing or condescending or something. How do you remove the stigma, I guess, of being preachy from environmental fiction so that people will listen?
So, for people who didn't hear the question, how do you remove the stigma of being preachy from environmental fiction so that people will actually listen? I wish I could answer that. That is a huge question. I mean, one of the last chapter in this book I mentioned earlier, Rising, it sounds like something you'd be really interested in, because one of the things she talks about, of course she's writing literary nonfiction, but her whole thing is you can't walk up to people and show them data and charts and be like, climate change is happening, because no one, people, their eyes glaze over, they don't want to hear it. You can't tell them they're wrong if they say that it doesn't exist. But what she does so incredibly well in that book is she says you have to listen to people and meet them where they're at. So you have to hear what they're actually saying, hear what their stories are, and to try to respond to them and listen to these sort of local stories that they can tell you about their own environmental experiences, and that it has to be the starting place. And I guess to go back to Zora Neale Hurston, I think one of the fascinating things that actually connects her book to this recent book by Elizabeth Rush is that both of them are giving voice to these local populations who are the people who know the most about climate change often, because they're the ones who are disproportionately affected by these issues. So in Zora Neale Hurston's book, the book is framed as a story told by one woman of color to another on her porch. Basically, that is the framing of the narrative. And then in Elizabeth Rush's story, it's all these first-person narratives from people who live in these compromised places. And I think that what those have in common is they're really listening carefully to people telling their own stories. And it's interesting. I mean, those people have the most knowledge to share. They're often the ones that are most discounted, whose stories don't get told, because they're often the most socially or culturally or economically dispossessed. And I don't know if what I just said helps you in any way as a fiction writer, but that I think that sort of act of listening and just kind of hearing what locally people are saying.
See, I just think that fiction is pretty powerful, because with fiction, there's the idea of morality, because we've had a lot of fiction stories about there's a hero and a villain and stuff.
Yeah.
So once you have, I guess, the theme of morality, you kind of get people to really question, is what I'm doing right, stuff like that.
Yeah.
So.
I have the same advice for nonfiction writers that, life revolves around stories, right? And readers like to read stories. Stories, their interconnectedness is the through line in history, in nonfiction. And if you tell a story, you tell it honestly, you don't have to be preachy, as you said. You can, readers are generally pretty smart, and I think we can depend on them to get the message, particularly if it's conveyed honestly, in a voice that is not overbearing and of course condemnatory.
All right, thank you. I really enjoyed Dr. Davis talking on in terms of how constricted the terminology, vocabulary, humanities, dissertation, or academic papers are. And I just want to know, what are some ideas you guys have to better project the importance of humanities onto layman people, people not in the humanities field, in terms of like parents or public figures, and in terms of just project the importance of humanities or Florida's environmental history to people like parents and public figures, public officials.
You're handing it out to me.
I mean, it's a hard question to answer in a blanket way, I guess. I mean, one thing I've learned about writing anything, about doing any kind of scholarship, is that for me, it is a profoundly communal enterprise. And I think the thing to do is be writing with the audience, for me anyway, writing with an audience in mind of people who are not going to have a specialist background, and thinking about how you need to shape your, where you're meeting them in the book, like where you're beginning, you kind of meet people where they're at. And for me, the act of sharing my work through conversation and also through writing short pieces and sharing it with friends, with non-academic friends, with my family who've been gracious enough to read my work, that are, I guess the reason that's important is they end up telling you, whether they need to or not, what matters to them and what you should emphasize and how to pitch and how to frame your work. And so for me, it's been this evolving process of communicating the importance of my work by figuring out what it is about my particular academic interests that is also very interesting to non-academics. And the only way I know how to do that is to talk to them, to be talking to people about my work. And I look back and sort of shudder to think about conversations I had when I was first beginning work on this book that took me 10 years to write that's sitting over there, and how I couldn't articulate what the book was really about. And it was through conversations with others that I figured out what the book was about and also how it could relate to the everyday lives of those people. So that's what I would say. I think academics need to break through and get better at just sharing their ideas. And the first time you explain what you're writing about, people are going to look at you like that's so weird and arcane and strange, but you need that feedback and you need to then figure out, okay, you know what? I think I could have said that better. I think I could have said what was really driving me to write that in a better way, in a way that made sense to those people. And you can only figure that out through constant conversation and exchange.
So my advice is to emulate those who write the way you want to write. Those good writers who are able to, say, break down the science and translate it to a reader, and pay attention to how they construct sentences, how they construct paragraphs, how they are again breaking down the arcane or the technical for the reader. The other is also two other things. Another is have a good writing partner, which you suggested. Cynthia Barnett's mine. I read everything she writes in draft. She reads everything I write in draft. And it's a fantastic relationship we have where we trust each other. And she can say to me, Jack, you're sounding a little academic. And that's the last thing I want to do. And so she saves me from disaster. And we also have little games, like I was reading Lauren Groff, a piece that she'd written, and she used the word gamble, G-A-M-B-O-L. I said, oh my God, I love that word. I said, Cynthia was writing a book, Rain, I was writing the Gulf. I said, Cynthia, this is our challenge. We gotta find a place for gamble in our books. Which we did. And so the other thing is to always know who your audience is, or your desired audience is, and have that audience in mind for every single word you choose, the way you construct every sentence, the way you construct every paragraph. You've got to have that audience in mind. Will they understand this? Will they like this? Will they continue reading? Will I hook them? And that's where stories become so important. Stories teach lessons. And I mean, think of folk tradition stories, indigenous stories. Those are all stories that, pass on values in an understanding of the world to other people and to the next generation.
We had 2 more questions, but I've been signaled from the back that the time is up. So let's thank Jack and Michelle again. I'm going to stay around and answer any questions you might have. Thank you. Oh, and they have books. If you would like to buy their books, I'm sure they will sign them.
Yeah.